Ridgeback, Montana, 1884. There's a particular kind of cold that settles into a house when a man has lived alone too long, not the cold of weather, but of habit, of rooms that only ever hear one set of footsteps. Nathan Ashford knew that cold the way other men knew the sound of their own name. He was 54 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders with hands that had done every hard thing a ranch could ask of them, and he had been alone in that particular way for going on 6 years. His hair had gone the color of a winter sky at the temples, black threaded through with white, and his beard kept the same pattern, trimmed short but never quite tidy, because tidy required someone noticing whether it was tidy, and nobody had noticed in a long while. His wife had been named Sarah, and she had died of a fever in a spring that came green and hopeful and then took something from her anyway, as if to prove it could. She used to say a thing to him, back when saying things to him was still an ordinary part of an ordinary day. She said that a house without mending in it was a house that had given up expecting anybody to stay. Nathan had not understood it then, young and impatient. Now he understood it fully, alone in a house where nothing tore because nothing lived hard enough to tear. The town of Ridgeback sat in a fold of land between two ridges that gave it its name, a livery and a mercantile, and a church with a bell that rang half a second late every Sunday, a fact the congregation had made peace with generations ago. Nathan ran cattle on 1,100 acres his father had claimed, and he had doubled. He did not go to town more than he had to. He worked and came home, and the house was quiet, and that was the shape of his life, or he told himself often it was. Delilah Prescott was 26 years old and had been in Ridgeback for 11 months, having come west from Ohio after her father passed and left her with a small inheritance and a large question about what a woman alone was supposed to do with either. She had light red hair that caught every bit of sun that touched it, a soft coppery shade that made her impossible to lose in a crowd, and she wore a light blue dress most days, the color of a sky before the heat of day arrived. She moved through the world with a quiet, graceful competence that had already earned her steady work as the town's seamstress, taking in mending and piecing quilts and altering the mercantile's ready-made clothing to fit actual bodies. She was strikingly pretty in the way that made the younger men of Ridgeback suddenly find reasons to need buttons sewn on, though she noticed this with more amusement than interest, having come west specifically to build something of her own. Her mother, before she died when Delilah was 19, used to tell her that a needle was the most honest tool a person could own, because it could only do one thing, mend what was broken, and it never once asked whether the tear was worth the trouble. Delilah carried that quietly, and it had shaped her into a woman who saw torn things, whether cloth or otherwise, not as ruined, but as simply waiting. Ridgeback had opinions about Delilah, as small towns do about any unmarried woman who arrives capable and unaccompanied. Mrs. Adeline Norwood, who ran the mercantile with her husband, had already tried 3 times to introduce her to Wendell Pratt, the young clerk at the land office, a perfectly nice man of 24 who blushed whenever Delilah said good morning to him. Reverend Holt's wife thought it a shame, a woman of such obvious skill with no husband to sew for, and said so at the quilting circle with the particular sympathy reserved for situations one has decided are sad on someone else's behalf. Delilah bore all of it with the same even patience she brought to a stubborn hem, and let her work speak in the language it always spoke best. It was a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray Montana Tuesday that threatens snow all day and delivers it precisely at dusk, when Nathan Ashford came into town for feed and horseshoe nails and found himself standing outside Delilah's small shop, because the wind had picked up sharp and his old brown wool coat had a shoulder seam torn clean through from a fence post that caught it wrong 3 days earlier. He had meant to mend it himself, but his hands, so capable with rope and wire and wood, had never once managed a needle with any grace, and the seam had only gotten worse for his trying. He stood outside the shop a full minute before going in, the kind of hesitation a man does not examine too closely, and when the bell over the door rang and Delilah looked up from the counter, she saw a tall man with salt and pepper hair standing just inside the frame, hat in hand, looking faintly embarrassed to need anything at all. "I heard you mend coats," he said, which was not quite a question. "I mend anything that holds still long enough," she said, and something in her voice, dry and quick and entirely unbothered by his size or his silence or the general weather he seemed to carry in with him, made him nearly smile before he caught himself. He took the coat off, right there, feeling foolish standing in his shirt sleeves in a dress shop with the November cold coming through the door behind him, and she took it from him and turned the shoulder seam toward the window light and made a small sound, not quite disapproving, more like a woman assessing a problem she already knew how to solve. "This has been torn a while," she said. "You have been wearing it torn." "I have been meaning to fix it," he said. "With what?" she said, not looking up. "Your hands or your pride?" He did smile then, could not help it, a short, surprised sound more than an actual laugh, and told her 3 days, and she told him to come back Thursday, and he said Thursday was fine, and that was the whole of it. 4 minutes of conversation in a small shop with the wind picking up outside, and neither one of them thought much of it walking away, the way people rarely recognize the doorway they have just walked through until they are well past it. Nathan drove home in the dusk with the temperature dropping and his coat draped over the wagon seat beside him instead of on his back, and told himself the cold in his chest was just the weather, and mostly believed it. Delilah closed the shop that evening and sat by her lamp working another woman's hem, and found herself thinking, more than the 4 minutes warranted, about a man who had waited 3 days rather than ask for help, and who had smiled like it surprised him to do it. Neither one said anything about it to anyone, because there was, as far as either of them could tell, nothing yet to say. Thursday came gray and quiet, and Nathan told himself he was only picking up his coat, nothing more. A plain transaction between a man and the woman who fixed things for a living, and he half believed that too, right up until he was standing in her shop again, with no particular reason to still be standing there once the coat was paid for and folded over his arm. "You did good work," he said, turning the mended shoulder toward the light the way she had 3 days before, and finding the seam so clean he could barely trace where the tear had been. "It was an honest tear," she said. "Those mend easy. It is the ones people try to hide that give me trouble." He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. "I will remember that," he said, and did not entirely mean the coat. She noticed the way he said it, filed it somewhere she was not yet ready to examine, and told him if the seam ever went again to bring it straight back and not wait 3 days next time, and he said he would try, and left, and stood outside on the boardwalk a moment in the cold before remembering he had a wagon to drive home. That might have been the whole of it, except that 4 days later, a fence line on the north edge of Nathan's property came down in a hard wind, the same fence line bordering the small parcel Delilah had bought with what remained of her inheritance, a half-built cabin she was slowly making livable. Nathan noticed the brake riding his line, saw it ran along her side too, and without particularly deciding to, found himself repairing both sides of it before noon, because a broken fence between two properties, he told himself, was simply a thing that needed doing. He did not knock on her door to tell her. He simply finished the work and rode home, and it was 2 days before Delilah, walking her own line, found the fence whole and freshly wired and understood exactly whose hands had done it, because Ridgeback was small enough that a person came to know work by its signature the way they knew handwriting. She said nothing about it either, but the following week when Nathan's shirt cuff frayed through at a seam, he found it mended and returned inside a small paper parcel left at the mercantile with his name on it, no bill enclosed. "You did not have to do that," he said, holding up the mended cuff like evidence. "I know," she said. "Neither did you with the fence." "I know," he said. And something passed between them in that small exchange, a recognition of a shape neither one was ready to name, two people who had each decided, without conference, that certain kindnesses did not require asking or announcing. The town noticed before either of them fully admitted what there was to notice. Mrs. Norwood remarked to her husband that Nathan had been into the mercantile 3 times in 2 weeks, a man who used to manage on 1 trip a month, and his account had also picked up small unexplained purchases, a length of ribbon here, a paper of pins there, nothing that made sense for a rancher living alone, unless a seamstress might have use for exactly such things. Nathan told himself he was only being neighborly. Delilah told herself she was only doing careful work for a fair customer. Neither explanation held up under close examination, but neither one examined it too closely. There is a particular kind of fear that belongs only to people who have already lost something large, and Nathan carried that fear the way he carried everything, quietly and without complaint. He had buried a wife once, and had told himself in the raw months afterward that a man only had the strength in him for that kind of loss one time in a life, and he had already spent his. To want again, at 54, with gray in his hair and 30 years of hard weather in his hands, felt to him less like hope and more like inviting a debt he had no intention of being able to pay twice. He was old enough, he told himself on the long rides home, to know better than to want a woman not yet 30. He filed Delilah into the safest category he could construct, a kind young woman who did good work, and told himself that category was the truth, even as it grew less true every week. Delilah's fear wore a different coat entirely. She had left Ohio partly because a young man there, Thomas Ellery, had courted her for the better part of 2 years, and then, when her father's small estate proved smaller than hoped, had quietly stopped calling. A lesson she had absorbed more thoroughly than she liked to admit, that being wanted and being wanted for something could look identical right up until they were tested. She had come west to build a life that depended on nobody's continued interest, precisely so she would never again have to find out which kind of wanting a man's affection actually was. To let herself notice, Nathan felt dangerously close to repeating a mistake she had crossed a country to avoid, and so she told herself what she felt was simple gratitude for a good neighbor, nothing more. Meanwhile, Wendell Pratt, the young land office clerk Mrs. Norwood had been quietly encouraging, finally worked up the courage to bring Delilah a proper bouquet ordered from Helena, asking if she might consider taking supper with him some evening. Delilah let him down as gently as the request allowed, but the exchange happened in full view of the boardwalk, and Nathan, arriving just then with an excuse about nails he did not actually need, saw the flowers and felt something in his chest clench tight and unfamiliar, a feeling he recognized as jealousy, an emotion he had believed himself long past having any right to. He said nothing about it. But that night, alone in his quiet house, he sat a long while by the fire, turning over the plain fact that a young clerk with no gray in his hair had just offered Delilah flowers and supper, and that Nathan himself, older and settled and entirely unentitled to any opinion on the matter, had felt something close to panic at the sight of it. The weeks moved into deeper winter, and the bond between them deepened along with the season. Nathan brought over a load of split firewood one bitter week without being asked, stacking it neat against the north wall of her cabin before she was even awake, so that she woke to find it simply there. Delilah, in turn, noticed the collar of his good church shirt had gone thin and replaced it without being asked, returning the shirt so cleanly repaired he did not notice the difference until he put it on. "You did not have to do that," he said again, and she said, as she always said now, "I know," and the phrase had become theirs, small and worn smooth with use. His dog, a graying blue heeler named Scout, who answered to almost nothing except his own judgment, took to Delilah with an immediacy Nathan found almost insulting, trotting straight to her whenever she came near the property line, as if the dog had already settled a question the two humans were still stubbornly debating. "Then you had better decide quick whether you mean to," Silas said, "because everyone else in this town has already decided what they are seeing, and men your age do not get the luxury of taking their time about such things the way young ones do." The words followed Nathan home, and sat with him that night heavier than they should have, because they named the exact fear he had been carrying unspoken for weeks, that he was too old for this, too old to start again, too old to offer a woman not yet 30 the kind of long future she deserved, rather than the shorter one his years actually promised. He thought of Sarah, and of the things she used to say about mending, and lay awake a long while turning it all over without arriving anywhere close to settled. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is the part where a man like Nathan Ashford has to decide what kind of arithmetic he is actually doing. It is easy at a certain age to count only the years already spent and call that the whole sum. It is harder and truer to count what a person still has to give and to trust that the giving matters more than the counting. Nathan had not gotten there yet, but he was getting closer than he knew. If you have been enjoying this story so far, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, whether that is somewhere across the United States, up in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia or anywhere else this voice happens to be reaching. Drop your country down in the comments. It truly does mean a great deal to see how far these old stories travel. Now, let us get back to it, because Nathan Ashford is about to do something he has not done in 6 years, which is knock on a woman's door for a reason that has nothing at all to do with fences or coats. He did not go that night, but 3 days later, with Silas Granger's words still sitting uncomfortably in his chest, he found himself at Delilah's door regardless, holding nothing, needing nothing mended, having invented no excuse beyond the plain truth that he wanted to see her. And when she opened the door and saw him standing there with no coat to fix, she understood immediately that something had shifted. "I do not have a reason," he said, which felt, to a man who had spent 6 years needing a reason for everything, like the most honest sentence he had spoken in a long time. "You do not need one," she said, and stepped back to let him in out of the cold, and the fear that had been sitting in her chest since Thomas Ellery eased just slightly at the plain, unconditional shape of him wanting nothing but her company. But the ease did not last past the following week, when word reached Delilah, through Mrs. Norwood's determined channels, that a widow from Bozeman named Louisa Fitch, a woman closer to Nathan's own age with a fine reputation, had written to Reverend Holt inquiring after suitable introductions in Ridgeback, and that Nathan's name had specifically come up. Delilah heard the news secondhand at the mercantile counter and felt something drop through her chest that she had no right, by her own accounting, to feel. She said nothing to him about it, but he noticed a new carefulness in her manner, the particular distance of a woman protecting herself against a hurt she suspects is already arriving. And it took him 2 days of watching that distance to learn, through his own channels, exactly what had prompted it. He rode to her cabin that evening without waiting for an invitation, and when she opened the door, he did not wait for pleasantries either. "I heard about the letter from Bozeman," he said. "I have not answered it, and I am not going to." "You do not owe me any explanation," she said, careful, guarded, the coppery light of her hair catching the lamp behind her. "We have never spoken of anything to explain." "Then I am speaking of it now," he said, and stepped inside, and stood there in her small, warm kitchen with Scout thumping his tail hopefully against the floorboards, and said the thing he had been circling for weeks. "I'm 54 years old, Delilah. I have gray in my beard and 30 years of hard land in my hands, and I buried a wife once already. There is a woman in Bozeman my own age that half this town thinks I ought to write back to, and by every sensible measure they are right. But I have not been able to make myself want that. I have only been able to want you, and I have spent a month telling myself that wanting was foolish, and I am tired of telling myself that." Delilah stood very still, the needle she had been holding forgotten in her hand. "That's a great many years between us," she said quietly, not as an accusation, but as the plain arithmetic she had also been doing. "Then yes," she said, and the word settled into the small, warm kitchen like something finally arriving home after a very long ride, and Nathan Ashford, 54 years old and certain until that moment that he had already used up his one allotted chance at this particular kind of joy, crossed the small distance between them and kissed her, careful and certain both at once, while Scout thumped his tail against the floorboards in unmistakable approval. Word moved through Ridgeback the way it always did, fast and thorough, and the town's reaction split roughly along the lines everyone might have predicted. Mrs. Norwood, delighted to have something new to discuss, declared she had seen it coming since the second parcel of ribbon. Reverend Holt's wife, who had once called it a shame, now called it providence, with the easy flexibility such opinions often show once an outcome is settled. Silas Granger, to his credit, sought Nathan out at the mercantile and told him plainly that he had been wrong to say what he said back in November, that a man who could still stand in a woman's kitchen and mean every word of what Nathan had apparently said deserved better than an old friend's easy judgment, and Nathan shook his hand and told him no offense had been taken, though both men knew some had. They married in the spring, a full year almost to the day since Sarah's passing, which Nathan had worried over privately until Delilah, understanding exactly what he was worrying about, told him plainly that honoring one love had never once required refusing another, and that she suspected Sarah, whoever she had been, would rather see him whole again than see him faithful to an empty house. The wedding was held outside the little church with the bell that still rang a half-second late, the whole town in attendance, because Ridgeback, like every small town on earth, attended everything whether invited or not. And Delilah wore light blue, not white, because she had decided months earlier that a woman ought to be married in the color that suited her rather than the color convention demanded, and she looked in that pale blue dress with her coppery hair catching the spring sun, exactly as striking as Nathan had privately thought her since the very first Tuesday in his shop doorway. His hands, steady through 30 years of hard work, shook very slightly as he said his vows, a fact Delilah noticed and would tease him about gently. For years afterward, and when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he looked at her and said simply that he had spent 6 years believing a house without mending in it was a house nobody expected to stay in, and that she had proven, needle and patience and plain unhurried kindness, that some houses only needed the right person to walk back through the door. Mrs. Norwood cried through the whole ceremony and told everyone afterward that she had known it from the very start, which was not strictly true, but which nobody troubled to correct her on, because some fictions serve a town well enough to be left standing. The first year of their marriage settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with how easily it came. Nathan's ranch work and Delilah's shop finding a natural division that suited them. Her sewing hours moved partly into a bright east-facing room he built onto the house that spring specifically to catch her morning light, because he had noticed, without her ever mentioning it, that she worked best facing the sun. The account books, which Nathan had always kept in a rough, scattered way, grew tidier under her practical hand, and the house itself, quiet for so many years, filled with the ordinary noise of two people building a shared life, footsteps that were no longer only his. 3 years passed, seasons folding one into the next the way they do, and on a bright Tuesday morning in the second spring of their daughter's life, a girl they had named Sarah Rose, carrying her coppery hair straight from her mother, Delilah stood in the same small shop doorway where it had all begun, the little girl balanced on her hip reaching for the doorbell she loved to hear ring, and watched Nathan come up the boardwalk in his good coat, the same brown wool coat, mended so many times now at that same shoulder seam that the stitching had become its own small history, a map of every winter they had survived together. He came in stamping snow from his boots, though it was only a light spring dusting, and set his hat on the counter, and looked at his wife and his daughter with the particular expression of a man who still, 3 years on, could not quite believe his own good fortune. And Delilah, setting little Sarah Rose down to toddle toward Scout, who was old now himself and settled by the stove, exactly where he had settled every Sunday for years, looked at her husband's coat and smiled. "That seam is going again," she said. "I know," he said, and there was that same dry warmth in it that had been there from the very first Tuesday. "Careful, girl. A man my age gets used to being mended by you." "Good," she said, and meant it entirely. That was rather the point. I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this one out, because I think there is something worth saying plainly. We live in a world that likes its arithmetic simple, that likes to look at two numbers side by side and decide on the strength of the difference between them what a love story is and is not allowed to become. Nathan Ashford was not wrong that the years between himself and Delilah were real, that they carried weight, that a town would notice and a friend would warn him and a widow's letter would arrive from Bozeman offering the safer sum. But he learned, the way people so often learn only by living it, that a life is not actually measured by the years stacked up behind a person. It is measured by what they are still willing to offer with the years still ahead of them, however many or few those turn out to be. Delilah, for her part, had to learn something just as hard, that being loved fully is not the same as being loved conveniently, and that a man who drives 11 miles through the cold with nothing invented to say has already answered, in the driving alone, whatever question she was afraid to ask. Their story was never really about a torn coat or a mended seam, or even a house that finally stopped being quiet. It was about two people who each carried a private fear that they were somehow the wrong shape for love, too old, too young, too late, too cautious, and who found, entirely by accident on an ordinary gray Tuesday, that the right person does not measure your shape at all. They simply notice what needs mending, and they stay long enough to do it. Thank you so much for spending this hour with Nathan and Delilah tonight, wherever in the world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know in the comments, were you rooting for the two of them from that very first Tuesday in the shop, or did it take you a little longer, the way it took Delilah herself, to trust that this particular kind of wanting was the honest kind? If this story kept you good company tonight, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel cost you nothing at all and mean a great deal to us. And if you know somebody who could use a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider sending it their way. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you sleep warm, and I hope something in your own life gets mended soon, in whatever way it needs mending. Until next time, keep writing.